my soul.
Welcome to Conversations in Color, a weekly series committed to open, honest conversation and exploring hard questions regarding race and racism in Western Wisconsin and beyond. Here is your host, Ed Hudgins.
Well, hello there and welcome to Conversations in Color, emanating from the Pablo Center at the Confluence down here in downtown Eau Claire. We're so glad that you are joining us tonight. My name is Ed Hudgins. I work with Converge Radio and also host a show on Converge called the TS Experience. So glad that you are joining us. We're excited to talk about the idea of protest and some of the realities and rumors and dynamics around the idea of protest. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about what this show is. Conversations in Color is an effort for us as a community, as community members, to kind of lean in together and ask some hard questions and talk about difficult things when it comes to race and race issues. And we want to have a safe space where we can talk about that stuff and really listen. And highlighting that and really undergirding that mission are three kind of pillars, our ethos, if you will. And those three things are humanity, honesty, and humility. Humanity, we look at and believe in the dignity and value of every human being. And so nobody's going to be vilified or degraded on this show. In terms of humility, we recognize that we don't know, none of us knows everything there is to know about anything, even ourselves, if we're honest. And so we come into these conversations with a measure of humility, knowing our limitations. And then there's honesty, of course. We want to lean in on the hard stuff. If we're not leaning in on the hard stuff and talking about real issues, we're really not getting anything accomplished. And so that's what this show is about. And we hope that as you listen in, and if you're watching on the Pablo live stream, that you'll be engaged with us, listening to what we have to say. But also, if you have questions and comments, we would welcome those, and we'll give you an avenue for that here in just a moment. One little disappointment for tonight: Jasmine Baker from Vote Mob Eau Claire was going to join us. She was planning on joining us, but she was unable to. She was a little under the weather and didn't feel like she wanted to spread all that with us, which I appreciate. But we do have our resident panelist on board, the Honorable Dr. Selika Ducksworth-Lawton, who is the president of Uniting Bridges here in Eau Claire and a professor of history over at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, and she wears about 25 other hats as well. Welcome once again, Selika.
Thank you.
So glad that you are here.
Glad to be here. And I'll be talking about protests and about the protests that we had over the weekend 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's good stuff. We got some good stuff to dive into.
We do, because I was one of the lead organizers with EC Rise Up and with Luke Seidel from EC Justice. And I'll talk about some of the things that we did and why we did them and what it takes to keep a protest nonviolent.
Right, and why that's even important.
And why that is important. Why should we choose nonviolence?
But before we dive into any of that, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the also esteemed Mr. Adam Accola, who is here. He works with CoLab here in Eau Claire, also wears a bunch of different hats. He is indispensable to this operation. Adam, thank you so much for being here. What are you going to be up to this evening?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. I will be focusing on community engagement tonight. So if you are joining us on the Paragon live stream, you can drop questions in the chat, and I'll intersperse those into our conversation tonight. If you don't feel comfortable dropping it in the regular chat, you can right-click my name and private message it to me. You can also call 715-600-0267. One more time, that's 715-600-0267. You can call that number, and we will have someone on the other end taking questions by phone. So if you are joining us on Converge Radio 99.9 FM or over the web, you can feel free to call that number to have your questions asked in tonight's conversation.
Great, great. Well, Adam, sometimes you have a question for us, to start the evening out?
Sometimes I do have a question, and we like to say it's the most important question of the evening to kind of set a little bit of a lighter tone for what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the question tonight is, would you rather be the funniest or the smartest person in a room? And I'll toss it to you first, Ed.
Well, thank you. I'm accustomed to being both, Adam. I've been thinking, ever since you mentioned that question, I've been thinking that answer. No, you raised a great point earlier. We were talking a little bit about this question, and you said sometimes the smartest person in the room doesn't get listened to, and sometimes the funniest person doesn't get taken seriously, which, by the way, is a very negative way to look at it, Adam. I don't know. I think for me, I think sometimes being the idea of being the smartest person in the room, I can't say that I've ever actually experienced that. But sometimes that I think about that and I'm like, how frustrating would it be to not be able to talk to people about certain things because they're just not going to be able to track with you. So I'm going to go with funny because, I don't know, I'm insecure or something. I don't know. What do you think, Selika?
I don't think you're insecure. I think I would rather be the funniest because I have sometimes found it's good for people to underestimate me. And it takes a lot of smarts to be funny.
It's true.
And if you're really good at it, you can hide all sorts of things within funny. So it'll get the point
your
across.
answer's strategic.
Well, yeah, it's. I can't remember which comedian said nobody wants to be preached at, but they'll listen to it if it's wrapped in funny. I think that was Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor, anyway, I'm not going to follow him as a role model in life, because getting set on fire pre-base and coke, that's not any kind of goal I want. But I think this is a really good piece of advice. I really do.
What about you, Adam?
I would probably have to say I would want to be the smartest person in the room, and hopefully being smart would allow me to recognize when somebody wasn't comprehending what I was talking about, and I was able to break it down and able to explain it a little bit better than someone that maybe wouldn't be quite as smart. So I think I would say smart in hopes that I would be able to talk to people that might not think that smart people can talk to them.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who's experienced both on a regular basis, I can tell you there's a skill necessary to be able to communicate with those of lesser intelligence.
There are many forms of intelligence. We all have different skill sets of intelligence.
I know. I'm totally full of it. So I thought you knew that by now.
The smartest, I'm not going to even pick the bait on that. The smartest people know how to talk to everybody.
It's true. It's true.
And they respect everybody, and they don't, the smartest people realize the limits of their intelligence. Somebody who thinks that they know everything is really not smart.
Well, I must be getting really smart, because the older I get, the more I recognize how little I actually know.
Well, see, that's why historians are one of the fields where you get better as you get older.
Yeah.
Because, you start out, you think you know everything, and then you gradually realize, nope, I know this much box.
Yeah.
And that's it. And it makes you more humble. And I think the more humble you are, the better you are as a learner and a teacher.
Makes sense to me. Adam, thank you for the question. And it is important. We like to do this icebreaker type of question because one of the things that as we lean in on some of these hard things, we want to make sure that everybody sees those that you might be looking at on this live stream. We're just people with real stuff happening, and we have our own struggles. We're just real people, just like everybody else. So that's important. And I say that especially when we have people like Dr. Ducksworth-Lawton here, and these people with all these educational, we're just people. And we've got our own stuff going on, and it's important that we make sure we're connecting on that kind of level, because the stuff we're talking about, it affects human beings, real people. So we're talking about protest, and obviously there's been a lot about protest in the news here over the last few months, and really a lot longer than that. I think back to our most recent kind of burst of protest. To me, basically started a little bit with Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem back during the 2016 football season, and that sparked a lot of other types of protests that have happened. But you see, that's one way to protest, is to kneel during the national anthem. Another way to protest is a march, where you're marching with a bunch of people for a certain cause. Another kind of protest that we see looks more like just general unrest, where we see examples of this like in Portland, Oregon, and LA, Kenosha, Minneapolis, where there's stuff happening and it's hard to tell exactly what's trying to be accomplished at times. We've had protests right here in Eau Claire over the last few months, especially since the death of George Floyd. We've had several that I've been a part of, it's been an honor to be a part of. But when I think of the experiences I've had here, and then I look at what I see on the news, and I hear, I look at social media and the very diverse opinions, sometimes diametrically opposed opinions we have about the various kinds of protests that we see happening around the United States. There's just a lot to unpack with it. And we look at, and like in Los Angeles, for example, we saw some violence against police officers here recently, kind of in the name of protest. We've seen looting and rioting and property destruction in a variety of places. And then you hear things about like something called Antifa, and potential of Black Lives Matter agitators from out of town coming in to do things, Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, all these different names and dynamics and all these things. And tonight we really want to focus on what protesting is about in the first place, kind of its place in American history, and start to maybe sort through some of these things and dispel some of the rumors about protest and bring to light some things that are real that we need to consider. So that's our goal for tonight, is to walk through those kinds of things together. I would say I'd like to start kind of talking about how protests are really ingrained in American history. And so we have a history professor here, so I would be really silly to try to answer this one without getting Selika involved. But could you talk to us a little bit about how deeply ingrained the idea of protest is in the history of America?
Well, I mean, it comes to us from the British. You think of the Roundhead Rebellion. You think of
the Roundhead Rebellion.
The Roundhead Rebellion in the 1670s and 80s was the uprising by commoners against the King of England. If you think of that song, Bonnie Prince Charlie, they deposed him. And Cromwell Oliver Cromwell was the elected leader for 5 years until the Restoration. But from that, we get the Magna Carta. From that, we get the idea that individuals have rights. And that comes out of the Enlightenment, really, which hits there 1580, in Europe, 1580 to 1740. It gets to the U.S., well, the colonies, about 1660 to 1690. And for us, it creates an identity, but it also creates an idea of inherent rights. And with that idea of inherent rights comes an idea of protest. You can start with Bacon's Rebellion in 1660, which really puts us on the road to slavery as well. But they're protesting that they weren't paid. So you'll see multiple acts of protest coming out of that Enlightenment, but also coming out of the self-rule in the colonies. Because from the minute we got here, the crown was too far away. So democracy in North America was born in the colonies that were here in our side, the British side of North America, up into what today we would call Canada, up into French Nova Scotia. So with the self-rule came the idea of inherent rights and the idea of protest. And this country was born of protest. Whether there's conservative historians who will say that the U.S. is the result of the world's largest tax revolt. Because the British raised the taxes ostensibly to cover the cost of defending the colonies, but really because the British were in what was truly the First World War. What we call the 7 Years' War, or really was a world war. I mean, you had the British and the French fighting around Cape Hatteras. The French and the Spanish are going up and down the Mississippi River. This was a world war. And the purpose of a colony is to send money back to the home.
Right.
You know, this was mercantilism. It's not capitalism. So in a colony, the money goes one way. So to the British at home, of course you raise, you know, taxes on the colonies. You don't raise taxes at home. The colonies are supposed to pay for everything. To the people or the colonists, it's like, we're defending ourselves. We're not getting anything for this money.
Right.
And these British soldiers you're putting in our houses are raping women, stealing things, and getting drunk in the street. And they weren't British, they were Hessians. But mercenaries who were working for the British Crown. And usual engaging in the kind of misbehavior that armed individuals do when they get to bully everybody else. So there's a long history here of seeing protest linked with self-defense. I mean, if you drive around Eau Claire, you'll see a bunch of yellow flags with "Don't tread on me."
Right.
And that really comes from that idea of the revolution, that comes from that idea of not being oppressed, and that comes from that idea that you have natural rights. And this is really what sets the U.S. off against other countries. We believe that your rights are inherent to you as a human. Your rights are not inherent to the state. You don't get the rights that the state allows you. You have these rights. And the state only has the rights that we allow it. And that's something that's gotten lost in the shuffle, especially with the law and order crowd, because this is a country that originated out of an idea that we restrain state power to have maximum freedom. So when you're screaming law and order and certain other things, you're ignoring that. And that "Don't tread on me" flag is supposed to be about restrained state power.
Right.
The weirdest thing as a historian is to see people with those yellow flags, and they're screaming to restrict people's access to certain things. They're screaming to force people to do things, or they're screaming to expand state power to surveil people. That's not what that flag means. But that's the whole thing. The way the founders wrote the Constitution, they're looking at Rome. They're looking back at ancient Rome, and they're looking at the problems of Rome, and they're looking at the demagoguery and the fears. And they wrote this Constitution so that the rights were supposed to fall equally on everyone. The problem in this country is that there were also certain inequalities written in that were supposed to protect the elite. Think the Electoral College, things like that.
Right.
And we've been protesting since 1780. The Federalist Papers were a protest to get us the Bill of Rights. People protested in the 1820s to get universal manhood suffrage. You know, we could say that the reason why we had a civil war was because in the 1850s we didn't allow peaceful protest. Because the planters didn't want peaceful protest. The irony is during the Civil War, and I just put up a whole bunch of articles about this in my class, so anybody who wants them can email them. While the Confederacy was fighting the Union, it was also fighting a whole bunch of poor whites going, I ain't fighting for no slaves. I don't own any slaves. I'm not fighting for plantation or rich person.
Yeah.
If I told you that over 100,000 white Southerners fought for the Union and helped to give us the edge to win, and that another 100,000 went and hid in the swamps so they didn't have to fight. And over in Nueces in Texas, the Confederates were so mad at the people who wouldn't fight, they go over and kill a bunch of white people who wouldn't fight. So we think of this Confederacy as this united South. It wasn't.
Yep.
Even during that Civil War, people were protesting.
Well, and that speaks to a little bit the inherent nature within the American psyche, if you will, of protest being the logical response to when my rights or somebody else's rights are not being respected, right? So I think about, you've already started to allude to some of this now. So think about the nature of protests over the course of American history. Like, we only got to 1780. There's a lot of American history left that we haven't talked about. We're not going to talk about all of it, but you think about the civil rights movement, you know, in the 20th century. You think about a great variety of things. Can you talk a little, give some great examples, if you would, of some of the great effects we've seen from protests, the kind of important change that has been put into effect because of protest?
Well, in the 1820s, we had what was called the Second Great Awakening. It was a religious revival. But it also challenged us, and this is where this idea of individualism comes through. And it comes from the idea that you have an individual relationship with God unmediated by a minister or a church, etc. From that comes what historians call the three great reform movements that have pushed change in the United States ever since. The temperance movement, which is anti-alcohol, and it becomes the war on drugs in the 1930s, and becomes formalized as a war on drug in 1972. But I say 1930s because we get the first drug act in 1931 and 32. The abolition movement, which is the anti-slavery movement, which becomes the civil rights movement, 1865. Women's suffrage, which comes from Galatians. Both the abolitionist movement and the women's suffrage movement come from Galatians, and comes from the quote, "In God there is no slave and free, in God there is no male and female." So these religious activists joined secular activists in protesting, pushing, creating pamphlets. If I just start with the abolitionist movement, it ends slavery. Now, okay, it ends chattel slavery, owning people as if you own a cow. It does not end slavery, because then we get Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is slavery by another name. Yep. But that abolitionist movement turns into the civil rights movement, and every step of the way, it's advancing rights for everyone. Whether we're talking about fighting against the Chinese Exclusion Act, whether we're talking about trying to protect the rights of immigrants, it really all traces back to that civil rights movement, which traces back to abolitionism in 1820. If we talk about women's suffrage, August 26th was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's federal right to vote.
Which doesn't happen without protest.
It doesn't happen without protest. And while I could be nitpicky and say it's white women's right to vote, because Asian women don't get the right to vote till 1952 in all states, Native American women don't get the right to vote until 1957 in all states. There's always some states that are going to lag behind and do illegal stuff until you sue them. And black women don't get the right to vote until 1965. But without that, without protest, you wouldn't have gotten any of it.
Right.
You wouldn't get a Labor Day without protest. That's the labor movement. You wouldn't have OSHA regulations. If I say the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, there's still a big plaque in New York to that. That's because over 150 women died in that factory because the factory owner chained the doors to keep them from going out to lunch, to keep them from taking breaks. And when that fire broke out, They all died. And people watched them die. They're pressing the bodies up against the windows. And that led to labor protests, which led to the safety regulations that we have today. So all of this comes from protests.
Yeah. And even outside of U.S. history, you know, I'm gonna show you the extent of my historian background. I've watched the movie Gandhi a million times. But you know, you think about Indian independence from England was born out of protest.
Well, yeah, and that protest really started in the 1820s, almost as soon as the British got there.
Right.
You know, in the 1850s. Did I mention my master's degree was British India?
I didn't know that. I might not have opened up that can of worms.
Yeah, you wouldn't have opened it. And my thesis was on the Indianization of the Indian Army. Mm. So the British in the Sepoy War, Hindu natives tried to push the British out of India. Unfortunately for them, the British had a blunderbuss, and that's the big smoothbore weapon that shoots nails and shrapnel and stuff. But they also had Gatling guns, right. Prototype Gatling guns, which is a prototype machine gun. But even after that, you're going to see protests in India. And it's Mahatma Gandhi who figures out how to mobilize nonviolent protest to force pressure at home and the cost of the empire to get the British to let go. And then you have the Israelis who took armed self-defense and guerrilla warfare to new levels to get Israel. And that was against the British too.
Yeah.
So protest is an international phenomenon.
So what we're saying, just to be clear, is that protest can be extremely effective.
Protests are extremely effective.
Okay. Because I think we need a level set, right? Like, there are people who will say, why are you protesting? What's that going to accomplish? Well, I don't know. You know, women can vote, and India's not under a British colony anymore, and
Israel exists.
I mean,
and Argentina isn't run by the generals anymore, and Nova Scotia has to have signs in English and French.
Yeah.
I mean, protest is effective. Many of the people watching may not be old enough to remember the nonviolent protests in the Philippines that got rid of the Marcos. But that's effective. And there's two categories of protests, really, we're talking about here. One is nonviolent and one is violent.
Right. And
we have to understand that the reason why elites don't like violent protest is because it is often effective. Mm. And if you look at coin theory, I can give you all sorts of background to why. But we've got a community question.
We've got several. We've got more stuff that we want to dive into for sure tonight, but it sounds like we've got a great response coming from the community, so we want to dive right in, Adam.
Yeah, we've got a couple questions here. First one comes from Luke, and it is talking about goals of our protests, specifically our local protests. What sorts of goals do you have when you hold these protests? And then we've got a couple follow-ups on violent versus nonviolent, but let's just talk about goals of these protests currently happening in our area and in the Midwest.
In the coalition that Uniting Bridges has worked with, we've had related goals, but sometimes they weren't exactly the same. So if we go back to the big protest, which was June 5th, that was the big George Floyd protest.
Which that was the one that started at Phoenix Park, and then there was the march through the Third Ward.
I had estimated about 2,500 people. The police say it was 4,000. I'm not going to fight them on that. But, and EC Justice was really born out of that march. The students wanted to provide solidarity for Minneapolis. Some of the other organizations who were involved, Jonah, et cetera, wanted to push for police reforms. And the students also wanted to push for police reforms. My organization, Uniting Bridges, along with Jonah, wanted to use the Eau Claire police in the way that we organized the march as a model for the state of Wisconsin and for Minnesota of how police can work with protesters, that marches don't have to be violent.
Right.
And Eau Claire Police was more than willing, along with the city of Eau Claire, to do that because they wanted, and that's why they supported the march. And I think my speech from that march, and it's still out there, said that we saw Eau Claire's police department and their response to that march as a model for what other cities should be, what we'd want to see in Milwaukee, what we wanted to see in Minneapolis. And we released, Uniting Bridges released a list of reforms in concert with ACLU. And that's the 8 Can't Wait then, and now that's been joined by Nix the 6. So for us, that march was to illustrate those demands and also to show that we could work together here in Eau Claire to push those demands peacefully. Because when I teach about protests and I teach about the civil rights movement, and especially SNCC and SCLC and CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, National Association of Colored People, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and
Thank you for that, because I can't keep up with everything.
There's an alphabet soup of organizations running around at this time period. You know, most of them are coming from, some of them come from the labor movement, and they're taking their tactics from everywhere. And in the labor movement, a march was meant to illustrate something. A march in and of itself doesn't do anything. I hate to pick on the science march, but I do. Because they marched, what, 2 years in a row? What have we gotten out of it? A march has to illustrate something. A march in and of itself is not enough. So the March on Washington illustrated the Civil Rights Bill. The marches here illustrated the police reforms. And for EC Justice, that has become, for the second march, which we saw 2 weeks ago, they want to ban tear gas and the use of rubber bullets. That's a very specific ask. For Uniting Bridges, that is, we want a set of statewide reforms around the idea of evidence-based policing, but we also want bans on chokeholds and no-knock rates. For EC Rise Up, I don't feel comfortable articulating their demands. I think they have to articulate their demands because EC Rise Up isn't in the coalition anymore. So I don't feel comfortable speaking for them.
And Selika, I think, so kind of two main points of what you just said are your kind of points in action in the protest. You're wanting that. You're wanting this evidence-based policing. You're wanting effective policing of protests and the ability to express yourself and express our community's thoughts and grievances in an effective and safe way, but also a list of demands that lives on past that protest and that we need to continue to advocate for after we walk through the streets, and not just, it doesn't end after we've walked 6 blocks. It's then you get home, you get on your computer, you start emailing your city council representatives, your county board representatives, your statewide representatives, your national representatives, and you start actually working on that end of it too on your own.
Yes.
So kind of two things in that.
Well, I'll say too, just real quick, one other thing that I think is this may not be ever a stated goal, but one of the things that I have witnessed from my time being, you know, there's 3 different events I've been a part of here, is you mentioned the solidarity with Minneapolis. I think it even extends to just solidarity with people here who are going to take a stand. And that level, to me, it's very encouraging for a lot of folks. It's been for me to see others standing up for what they think is right and standing against what they think is wrong. So I think even if that's never a stated goal, I feel like that's always an underlying goal, is that level of encouragement and solidarity.
I think for a lot of people who are at the marches, they were marching against racism. And they were marching to say that this is not a community that will tolerate racism and that will tolerate racist acts. So it was meant to be a warning to racists in some ways. And I think that's important too, but again, it had goals. You know, a discombobulated march that doesn't have goals can very easily be turned into violence.
Yep.
And that, Uniting Bridges does not want that, and Uniting Bridges has worked very hard with several of the marches we've been involved with. And I've been an ACLU legal observer at one of the marches here in Eau Claire, again, with that goal of protecting the journalists, protecting everyone. We do have a trained cadre now between Uniting Bridges and ACLU WI Chippewa Valley, who are legal observers. And you saw the legal observers really out and visible for the first time 2 weeks ago. And that's really important here. And it was important that the police supported us, because one of the things that we needed to show, not just the rest of the world, but other police departments, is that if you brutalize protesters, it backfires. But if you allow nonviolent protesters to speak their piece and to work within the system, then it lowers the volume of anger at you.
Yep.
You know, LAPD, and this moves us to LA and what just happened in LA. And my husband's from LA. And my husband worked for the police department there and the sheriff's department. So he knows people in both. But that's a city where protesters have been brutalized. That has probably nothing to do with the 2 sheriff's deputies who were ambushed. They're in an organization that has a problem with gang warfare. And I'm talking about the deputies against the deputies. There's some evidence that the person who ambushed the 2 deputies may also be a deputy. Or they may be a part of the organized crime that's there.
In other words, we don't really know what happened there.
We don't know. But the protesters, 4 protesters tried to block the hospital, or as in black circles we said, 4 idiot hoteps tried to block the hospital entrance. And people have been screaming up and down about that. And some of the protesters yelled that they wanted the sheriff deputies to die.
Yeah.
And see, that violates the 6 principles of nonviolence. We don't see the police as an enemy. We see the police as agents of the state, and we need to change the state. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think one of the important things that I've observed here locally, and this is a little bit we were talking about, you know, as we get into the flow of this conversation a little bit more. We were going to talk about the local protests. So this question from Luke really helps kind of get us there. But what I've observed is not only are the police like cool with it, but they have actually been supportive to a great extent.
And that's here. That's here
that's what
in
I mean.
Menominee.
That's what I mean.
Kenosha is.
Yeah. So let's stay local with what we've experienced here. And I've had the honor of actually having a couple different conversations with Chief Rokas, and I'm convinced like that they really want significant change. They want to see. I mean, I heard it come out of his mouth that we want to see all of western Wisconsin and Chippewa Valley be anti-racist. And to hear that from the police is a far cry from what we've heard from other police departments historically and in other contexts.
And I'm going to give the credit for that to Jerry Matisic, as well as Chief Rokas, Jerry Matisic and Jerry Staniszewski. And Jerry Staniszewski, if you're not watching, this is why you should have been watching. Jerry Matisic became the chief in 2008, and he is the one who implemented evidence-based policing here. And it's cutting-edge policing, using computers, using statistical models, but also using research. And one of the first things he did was push against racial profiling. In 2010, it was the Eau Claire Police Department that nominated me to the statewide board against racial profiling. And I went to conferences with several of the watch commanders to talk about training to not profile. Because if you're profiling people for stereotypes, you're actually missing the real criminals. The criminals will manipulate the stereotypes to distract you, and then they'll kill you. So if you're busy looking at me in, let's say, Target, because you think all black people shoplift, you're going to miss the blonde white kid over there who's stealing all your merchandise.
Right.
And we have statistical evidence that pulling over young black men has what's called a lesser yield than pulling over young white men 18 to 25.
Yep.
You're much more likely to find drugs on that group than on the young black men who are coming up here.
Right.
And that's a class issue.
Right.
Yet we still see disproportionate stops. That's the power of stereotypes.
Yep.
So Jerry Matisic started working on it. He's working for Lexapro now. And Jerry Staniszewski followed in his footsteps and really continued that evidence-based policing and has spread it. I mean, Eric Atkinson in Menominee is pushing it as well.
Yep.
So I really do think the departments do want to see evidence-based policing and professionalization. I will say that my involvement with the UWC Police and the Eau Claire Police Departments, I am a police and fire commissioner, has scared me about the lack of professionalism in some police departments around here.
Yes.
I'm not going to say any names, I'm not going to say any details, but let's just say I've seen some stuff at interviews.
You've seen some stuff.
I have seen some stuff.
All right.
And this stuff was not Gomer Pyle either. Okay. We have a very professional police force here. And we assume that the Minneapolis police force is professional. We assume the Milwaukee one is. But the reality is that because of their police unions, they do less training than the ones here, and they're less professional in their scope than the ones here.
Right.
So what we want is to have professional policing all over the state and to have them not shooting the innocent people and letting the guilty go free.
Right.
You know, that's because if they're shooting the innocent people, then the guilty are going free.
Right.
That's the problem.
Well, so that's we could talk about the policing issue, and we have on the agenda in sometime in the near future to talk about policing in the Chippewa Valley once again. But I just wanted to raise that point that with the local protests that we've had here, I've seen officers when they were in full uniform out on the street, not just cooperative but facilitative.
Oh yeah.
Of what we were doing, which again, I want to be clear, like that's not what happens in every city. I think we have something kind of special happening here, and that and Chief Rokas, they tell you he'd be the first to tell you that there's stuff that still needs to change, and that they're very serious about that. But and I think the reason I bring that up is because that I'm kind of harping on that is because I think a lot of times when people think about protests, for example, they think about it in the same way that they think about police departments. So if every police department is either good or bad, there's nothing in between. Every protest is either good or bad, there's nothing in between. And that speaks to the polarization of our society these days, of course. But life in general is just much more nuanced than that. And I think about what we've experienced with our protest here, and it has looked significantly different than what I've seen in Portland, Minneapolis, wherever.
Well, where the police are cooperating with the protest leaders, the agents provocateur don't get the opportunity to create havoc.
We're going to unpack that a little bit more here in a minute. Yep.
And so that's really important there. The other thing that I think is important too is that, and it goes beyond police here. It is just here in Eau Claire, there is a willingness of people to cooperate that you don't see in some places. The Milwaukee activists I've worked with have gone, how do you get all these groups to be in coalition? And we're like, well, we're small and we're not going to waste resources.
Yep. And we talk to each other.
And we talk to each other, and we give each other fruit and leftover vegetables.
Right.
We commiserate with our dogs that go on self-guided tours of the neighborhood. So we're not fighting each other. Whereas down in Milwaukee and over in Minneapolis, you have groups that are fighting each other for grants rather than writing the grants together.
Yeah.
So there is more cooperation here as well. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that protest is legal.
Yeah, right.
And what we saw in Minneapolis and what we saw in Milwaukee were illegal attempts to suppress protest.
Yep.
If you suppress protest, it's kind of like air in a balloon. If you push down in the middle, it's coming out somewhere.
Right.
It's better to have a legal protest than it is to suppress it and then have it explode in other uglier ways.
Right. You're just escalating.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience with that the march that you were talking about earlier, the one that was about George Floyd,
right?
In solidarity with Minneapolis and such. That was an interesting experience for me. That was my first experience as a deacon, if you will, because Selika recruited me. She didn't have to recruit very hard, but to walk around downtown and kind of make sure the businesses were okay, because we had heard rumors about dumb things potentially happening and businesses being attacked, storefronts being attacked and that kind of thing. And so I spent some time downtown walking around, but I went on the march as well. And so when I was on the march, we had a couple of young men who showed up. And one was carrying a Blue Lives Matter flag. The other one was carrying an American flag. They were very much dressed in a way that would make you feel like they weren't necessarily trying to fit in and be a part of that movement that we were a part of that night. And it felt like they were trying to provoke some kind of response, or at the very least just being really stupid.
Well, people heard them say, these people are too nice, we can't provoke them.
Yeah.
Which is just like ridiculous.
Right. Well. So I had a personal run-in with them because I saw when they these two gentlemen kind of came alongside the march in the 3rd Ward here in Eau Claire, and I was watching them from a distance because I'm feeling like this is not wise. Them on their part, like this is not wise. And so eventually, some of the folks in the march started hollering at them and kind of getting in their face, and I, along with a couple other folks, stepped in and just tried to say, hey, look, don't give them what they want. Like we're going to give them the narrative that they want, basically. Let's not do that. Let's just ignore them. But I say that because we have had a little bit of resistance like that here. The other thing that was interesting for me is I texted you. But then after the march was done, actually, as we were moving closer to downtown, I walked into downtown and I saw them walking a couple of blocks ahead of me. And I ran into a police officer right by Acoustic Cafe. And I said to the police officer, those two guys, I think, were trying to cause a little trouble in the march. And he didn't hesitate. Got in actually radioed to another police officer that was going down the street. And the next thing I know, I can see him kind of just trailing them down.
I was in that car.
Were you? That doesn't surprise me.
That march was proof of concept for us, which is that we used the community ushers to de-escalate. We had the community watchers who were feeding information. I had 2 captains on the ground we were getting information to. I was getting information. And when those 2 guys showed up, there was another 3 guys who also showed up. Those 2 guys we were worried about because it was very clear they were trying to provoke and they were going into the crowd. One of my captains called me. I called the police chief and the deputy chief, and they sent a car. And we went and chased them to make sure that they didn't have a truck or something that they were going to try to ram the march with.
Right.
So we followed them.
Yeah.
And that's one of the considerations you have to do these days. But that's why having the watchers there, that's why having the connection to the police is important.
Yeah.
Although I will say, my brother called while I was in the police car, and I told him what I was doing, and he's like, "What are you doing?
You're in the
Are you
police car?
crazy? You're in the police car? Are you in the back of the police car?" "No, I'm in the front seat." "You're with the police." "Yes, but you're running the protest. How are you with the police?"
This is the point. This is why I'm saying. This is why I'm saying I think we have something special that's happening here. Like, to somebody from the outside, it seems foolish that the protesters the organizers would work with the police to facilitate the protest, because you're protesting something from the state. You know, you're protesting policy. You're protesting enforcement of those policies. And yet you're sitting in the police car with them on the night of the event.
That's right.
And they're tracking down people who are working against you.
They're tracking down the people who are trying to incite violence.
Right.
And it's not that these guys were against us, it's that they tried to incite violence.
Yeah.
And that is illegal. So they were preventing violence. And I think that is the key here. And the other key is that they've had enough training that they could see that it wasn't us trying to cause it.
Right.
And that's important, because when they go after the wrong group, that's when everything all explodes.
Right.
So to quarantine those people who want to provoke violence, or to de-escalate those people, are one of the keys. And that's why it's so important to work together. But that means that we need a change of culture with police and with protesters.
Absolutely.
We have a community.
We got some people who want to go off and do dumb stuff. So we're gonna have some more community questions here in a moment. Before we jump into that, I want to mention, if you have just tuned in the last little bit here, this is Conversations in Color here at the Pablo Center. My name is Ed Hudgins, and I've got Dr. Selika Ducksworth-Lawton from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire and Uniting Bridges joining me as always, and as always, Adam Accola from CoLab, who is a big part of this effort as well. We're talking tonight about protests, kind of the realities around them, as well as rumors and things that may not be real. And before we get into the community questions, I've got one more thing I want to bring up, and then I want to spend the rest of the time with whatever community questions we've got. You used the word agents provocateur earlier.
Yes.
So, how does that fit in? So we have two different levels of ways to talk about this. On one level, it's locally, and then we talk about what we see on the national level in other cities. So what about these folks who come in from outside of the local community? So people who aren't from Kenosha, who aren't from Eau Claire, Minneapolis. Infiltrators who come in with a different kind of agenda. Can you talk a little bit about some of those groups? Antifa might be one, the Proud Boys, Boogaloo Boys, all these different groups. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic? I think maybe start with Eau Claire.
Let's start with Eau Claire. And you have to understand that some are local and some are not. I mean, the Antifa here is local. But I'm going to quote one of them from, I won't say the name of their webpage because I don't want to send any trolls there. But when they're not trying to protect people at protest marches, they're either smoking weed or drinking coffee in a coffee shop. These guys are not guerrilla warfare. They're not Marxist soldiers or anything like that. They see themselves as a home guard for the community. So they're local. And the Antifa in Minneapolis is local, and the Antifa in Milwaukee is local. The outsiders would be the black box anarchists who come in. They believe that destroying things and destroying government is the way to get to anarchy for them. When we use that phrase, set it on fire and watch it burn, that's these guys. So they're the ones who will dress in the black. They tend to come from outside. They're not going to burn their own community. And you saw some of that in Minneapolis. But what you saw more were the Proud Boys being organized on 8chan, flying in and coming in with the cars with no license plates. Now, if the state troopers in Minnesota had been on it, they should have stopped those cars. You see a car with no license plate. Is it legal to drive a car with no license plates? So those should have been stopped.
Right.
And that's a problem of training there. So they were coming in. They were coming in from Iowa. They were coming in from Wisconsin. 2 critter children were caught by the American Indian movement up there and returned to. At first they said they were from Eau Claire. Then they said they were from St. Croix. Who knows where they were from? They were from Wisconsin. Their parents had to come get them. So
couple of white teenagers.
Couple of white teenagers.
Just want to call that out.
Now, what's interesting here, when the marches are all black, as you saw in Atlanta, the armed march in Atlanta, and some of the other marches, it's actually easier to keep the outside agitators out.
Yep.
And this sounds horrible, but if they're white, then they get questioned. And if they don't know them, they won't let them march. But in Minneapolis and Milwaukee, the majority of the marchers were white. And it was easier for the Proud Boys. It was easier for these groups. And the groups here, the Proud Boys, all right, the guy in Kenosha they're saying he's a 3%er. I've had a couple of 3%ers contact me by Facebook Messenger saying...
What is a 3%er?
A 3%er is the 3% of white people who will fight for the white race. There's 3%ers there. The news media says they're white supremacists. These guys are saying they're not white supremacists. They're just 2A, and they're against violence. I'm not going to analyze that. But the 17-year-old who shot people in Kenosha said he was a 3%er. There is a group called 5%ers. They're part of the Nation of Islam. They're black. And they're black extremists like the black Israelites. But they are more likely to not vote, and they're more likely to shoot you if you go into their part of town. They're not coming out to do offensive violence, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So these are 2 different groups.
They're not striking out.
No. But Proud Boys, Antifa, Atomwaffen, Wisconsin has a number of them. Actually, Milwaukee and northern Wisconsin has a lot of hate groups here because South St. Paul is the headquarters for 2 of the biggest hate music companies in the world. What used to be Panzerfaust Records, it's now called Tightrope Records. And the other one, I can't remember its old name, but now it's called Resistance Records. Those are white supremacist record companies, and they're based out of South St. Paul. So you have this huge number of white supremacist groups in South St. Paul, and you have a protest march. And they're like, gee, I can go and I can blow up some gay businesses and some black businesses, and people will think it's the protesters. Because we want to think these people are stupid, and they're not.
Right.
They're not stupid at all. And that's the problem. We shouldn't be underestimating them like this. And when you understand that New Aryan Nations is over there in Racine, all of a sudden what happens in Kenosha looks a lot more understandable. So they're here. Now, we had, 2 weeks ago, what we had was a bunch of individuals going, we're going to lock and load, and we're going to go shoot protesters. And what they don't understand is nowhere on the internet is safe from prying eyes.
Those might be the ones who aren't quite as smart.
Let's just say, when I worked at RAND, one of the things that we were taught is the most important part of any military operation is intelligence. And you need to know what your enemy is up to. Because and the reason why we won World War II is we knew the enemy better than they knew us. The reason why the civil rights movement was able to do what it did was because it did a power analysis and knew the white supremacists better than they knew blacks. So, as Adam can testify, some of my friends and I made sure to figure out who it was who would want to come and disrupt this march.
So I'm going to let me make a comment to that, and then let's jump into some community questions. What I have observed, once again, I'm just going to say it that way because it's not like I have a full line of understanding on everything that's happened even in Eau Claire in terms of protests. But what I've observed is with the police cooperation, you talked earlier about how that dynamic of having the police help to facilitate things, how that automatically wards off some of these elements you're talking about. And then we had, at the last protest, we had a group of people who showed up it's hard to classify them as counter-protesters. But
they don't want to be called counter-protesters.
And that's fine. I mean, I don't have any ill will towards them. I mean, there was the one dude who kept booing us that I would make fun of him a little bit maybe, but...
I offered him water. He did not appreciate me offering him a bottle of water.
He told us to go back to Minneapolis, and I didn't know anybody there who was from Minneapolis.
No, that was all local people.
But my point, though, is what I observed there is you took water to them. You took water to the people who were standing in opposition to what was happening there.
Yeah.
And that from what I understand, a couple of them started handing water out to the protesters.
Yes.
So like building a connection with the person who thinks they're on the other side from you, like that, there's just a dynamic there that most people aren't used to.
Well, I thought I recognized at least two of them, and it turned out I did. And but the other thing was sometimes you need to reach out to the humanity of people. And I had spent 3 days doing rumor control. I mean, I think my favorite rumor was the Friday morning one where somebody tried to swear that a busload of BLM terrorists had gone to Perkins. I did not make that up. I mean, that is like documented.
Is Perkins like the place where BLM protesters from other towns are supposed to meet up?
I don't know. I guess black people aren't allowed to have pancakes. I don't know. I don't know. But it was like five of these complaints, and they're coming to me and they're coming to the police. The police sent a police car over there, and I can tell you the cameras showed that there were no buses from anybody at Perkins. But that gossip was repeated. Eau Claire stuff for sale, which is kind of notorious for. I mean, if you want to find irresponsible gossiping, it's there.
Yeah.
That site.
Check out social media comments for our local news.
I would say, what is it? You know, you're from Eau Claire. I think we spent, I wound up putting 3 people on that site just to do rumor control, because I wish the moderator would just, when they see those kind of rumors, just please delete them. I mean, you know, we did. Some people were saying that there were armed truckloads coming up from
weren't we going to burn down the courthouse or something?
We were supposed to burn. The people who were there, who were looking at me hard, who were looking at me, an older, my friend's an 80-year-old doctor and his wife, who's a nurse, and my other friend, who is a 68-year-old retired EMT. And they're looking at us, and we're unloading water, and they had been told we were going to burn down the courthouse. They had been told that busloads of BLM protesters were coming to burn down the courthouse.
I never saw that on the strategic plan for the protests, and I was a part of, helping to plan it. Adam, did you ever see the burning down the courthouse?
No, that wasn't on my agenda.
Okay, just checking.
I did not wear my clothes for that day.
Oh, it's a whole other conversation now.
I walked. They looked hot.
Yeah.
They looked like they were hot. It was a hot day. This is like 4:30 in the afternoon, and they're wearing bike leathers. And we had a lot of water. People had donated a lot of water.
That's true.
So I took them some water, and they said, well, we're not here to stop your free speech. We just don't want you to burn down the courthouse. And I'm looking at them going, we're not going to burn down the courthouse. We just want to do, we want everybody to have the same kind of policing we have. oh. And then they asked if they could give water to the protesters. And I said, yeah, because I had like 15 flats back there, so I was going to take all the help I could get to give water to people.
That's the stuff right there, though. That's where you cut through the crap. All right, that's all the rumors, all the junk that either side, right, left, whatever, are notorious for putting out dumb stuff about what the other side is up to, and that's cutting through all that junk and getting to we're human beings. This is what this is about. I can say, with all integrity, I have never burned down anything. And I don't really intend to. So, I don't know, but I know we've got some questions.
I'm from rural Louisiana. There may be a tree that or a mailbox that may have been
You better start
fireworked.
incriminating yourself.
Hey, it's over.
So before
Is there anyone from
goes...
Louisiana that hasn't blown up a mailbox?
Before Selika goes any further, I did also just want to say on the social media component of the protest 2 weeks ago, that's really what conflamed a lot of the air quotes counter-protesters that came, and should both sets of protesters engaged one another, they would have been arguing completely different things.
Exactly.
The people that were there because they had seen posts and they had seen rumors on social media that were being perpetuated by people that may have had good intentions, but frankly, your intentions don't matter when the effects turn violent or the effects turn deadly. That's not okay. That's not okay for our news outlets, WQOW and WEAU, to allow in their comment sections.
Thank you.
That's not okay for our groups on Facebook and the moderators who run those groups to allow in those groups. And that spreading of misinformation is detrimental to life. Like, it literally gets people killed in some instances. The people that showed up to this protest 2 weeks ago were armed, and it could have easily turned into something deadly, and that's not okay. So it doesn't matter your intentions. The effects are what actually need to be accounted for.
Thank you.
So with that
I
said,
knew when I walked over there, some of them could be racist. And to be honest, two of them immediately took off after the others talked to me, because they clearly felt, I don't know, betrayed, or they had lost whiteness or something. I don't know. But they took off, and it was really squealing wheelies out of the parking lot. But all it took, if you saw those rumors, I was all over the press. All they had to do was hit me on Facebook Messenger or email me at work and ask, is this what you're doing? And none of these people who passed these idiot rumors thought to just email an organizer whose names were front page in the newspaper, and say, did you order up a couple of truckloads of BLM protesters? Did you do that?
No, we didn't need to.
I'm like, we got some, no.
Yeah. Okay, so community questions. We've got a couple questions on this topic, one from Grant, one from Samantha. Is a peaceful protest going to produce change, or do you have to create some sort of pain to the majority group in order to be effective to create change, such as destruction of property and civil unrest? I mean, the protests in Minneapolis are still ongoing, but we haven't really heard about them since the beginning of June because the violence has since quelled. So how do you get that national attention? How do you maintain that spark that exists when there is violent protest, because there's attention on it?
There's two things going on here. And I'm going to quote Alden Morris's Origins of the Civil Rights Movement here on how you organize a protest. The one thing, the reason why nonviolent protest is more effective than violent protest is that nonviolent protest keeps the focus on your issue. The problem with violent protest is people then focus on the violence and they don't focus on your issue anymore.
Right.
But, okay, so you've got a nonviolence protest and the press wants to ignore it. That's why you need a media management team. And your media management team needs to work with the press in order to keep that focus. You also need people to be writing the editorials. You need people to be pushing it out through the social media. For CORE, and I've been in the CORE papers that are at the Wisconsin Historical Society, they worked with the AP, they worked with CBS, they sent press releases to the reporters. They made personal relationships with them. And that's one of the reasons why even when they were nonviolent, look at the Selma March, you got really good coverage. But they also realized that certain types of protesting creates a better visual for TV. So that's why you had if they did a boycott, you had a march associated with it. Or you'd have a picket, because that gives TV the visual. So they worked with them. One of the things that we've lost and that we have to regain, and I'm going to blame Occupy for this, because when John L. Lewis tried to talk to them about it, they booed him off the stage, is the idea that you have to, one, organize a protest, but two, work with your different elements to organize a protest.
To different groups that might have other agendas.
You know, and this is where we have to bring the church people and the secular people back together. Because the churches are really great to organize through. They have the resources. They have the people who are committed. And to be honest, if you're Christian and you're really reading the Gospels and you're reading Sermon on the Mount, you're not going to be anti-gay. You're not going to be anti-black. You're not going to be sexist, because the Gospels aren't.
Yep. And we are going to be talking about that more at length.
That's another, we're going to have another one that's going to be race and religion. That's different.
Just real quick, though, I would also, let me add this, just from an ethical standpoint. I know not everybody gets with this, and that's fine. But to me, the means don't, the ends don't justify the means, necessarily.
Well, the problem is...
Well, just real quick, though, let me finish that thought, because I think one of the reasons that the optics of the civil rights movement, that whole thought process behind that and the strategic, there's the idea of a moral higher ground and taking the moral higher ground. And when you resort to violence, you forfeit the moral higher ground. I think that's one thing. And then there's the other piece, aside from strategy, aside from means and ends, there's the ethic. There's regardless of how effective it may be, is it the right thing to do? And that's, for me, I can't speak for anybody else, but for me, that's the bottom line. Like, I'm not going to become violent as a protester. I'm not going to damage property as a protester, because to me, ethically, I can't justify that as a human being, doing that to another human being.
The problem I have with property damage, what happened in Minneapolis is these outsiders came in and they burned black, brown, and queer shops.
Right.
In LA, it was black, brown, and queer shops in South Central that got burned. And that's a regulation. And the people who pay the biggest price for that are black, brown, and queer. When we talk about violence being the answer, well, they're not going downtown Atlanta and burning the CNN building. The closest you get is when these police stations get burnt. And the police station that got burnt in Minneapolis, that wasn't the local people who did it.
Right.
It's not the local people who are setting these fires. And that's what people are missing. I was in New Orleans when we had our riots in 1861. 1981. Okay, it's late. I need caffeine. I was not alive in 1861. I am not a vampire.
You look amazing.
I don't know Keith Richards. 1981. It's not the people who live there who will burn down an area. Right. That tends to be outsiders.
Yep. It's an important dynamic, I think.
You can cause pain without property damage. It's the second part here.
Yeah.
A boycott will cause pain. A picket will cause pain. Now that we have social media, you can run social media campaigns against them. I mean, Tucker Carlson, people are trying to remove all his advertisers. You want to cause some pain? get him to drop, get them to drop the advertisers. So there's multiple ways to cause economic pain without having to resort to property damage.
Right.
Property damage is intimidation.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to understand. It's not effective.
I think, too, it's just important to recognize for kind of everyone on the spectrum of this that all forms of protest are still legitimate forms of protest. Mm-hmm. And destruction of property is still a form of protest. The efficacy and the morality of it may be up for question, but it is a legitimate form of protest.
Well, when the French stormed the Bastille,
we dumped tea in Boston Harbor. We destroyed property of the British Empire to protest a tea tax. Yep. So American history, again, is rooted in protest and all sorts of protest. So yeah, a couple questions on violent versus nonviolent protest. Now another one on specifically the national anthem protest, which is a nonviolent protest.
Yes.
How do you respond to the veterans that are offended, and how do you think that this protest is effective? Follow-up on this is, since Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem as a poem as a tribute to the War of 1812 and the ambush from the British on Fort McHenry, do you think this may be a part of the veterans' frustration, specifically speaking to veterans who are frustrated by this?
Veterans weren't frustrated until people pushed a narrative that it was disrespectful to the flag. Because we don't see kneeling as disrespectful when we're praying.
Right.
And to be honest, it was veterans who first knelt to the flag. That was a protest used during the Vietnam War by soldiers coming back. And I mean, there's a long history of soldiers kneeling to the flag to deal with, as a protest. Kneeling to the flag is not an insult to veterans. And these veterans
or to the flag.
And that's where the problem is here. You have to ask them, why is kneeling, when I've asked them, why is kneeling to the flag insulting to you? And they're like, well, it's insulting to the flag. How is kneeling insulting? They don't have an answer. The biggest answer, they say it's against the flag code. And I'm like, wearing a flag on the seat of your pants is against the flag code too. Putting a plastic, or as a bikini, or as those little stupid plastic flags they put on the cars. I was a Girl Scout. I folded the flag. I helped to bring it down. Those things fly off, and then I see them in the gutter. That's a violation of the flag code.
Recoloring the flag is also a violation. Recoloring the flag in black,
line?
White, and blue, that is a violation of flag code.
Or putting a politician's face on it is also a violation of the flag code. So if kneeling, and the flag code doesn't say kneeling is bad, it doesn't say anything about it. My father-in-law was a Bronze Star winner in the Korean War. And he did not see kneeling to the flag as insulting to him, but he's black. And the only people I've heard say that have been white. And they need to look in the mirror and think about why. It's a peaceful protest. It's not burning the flag. Burning the flag, yes. Stepping on the flag, yes. But kneeling is not. And I'm just going to straight up say that. Kneeling is not disrespectful. What they're objecting to, when you push them, what they're objecting to is the argument that America is not the greatest country in the world.
Cut right to the chase. There it is.
And that problem right there, that comment right there should be a problem if you're Christian. It's the God Bless America thing. The Bible doesn't say anything about the U.S. And some of us Americans need to be a little more humble and a little less arrogant. It's okay to be patriotic. It is not okay to be idiotic. You know, and the whole flag thing is what I call performative patriotism.
Right.
When I first went to RAND, the first lecture we got, and it was the whole place, was on Richard Branson. Richard Branson had stolen secrets from the FBI and CIA, sold them to Russia. Dude was a member of Opus Dei. Dude had a flag pin on, American flag outside his house. You know, he was the whole Manchurian candidate, psycho-conservative. All of that would scream at you if you didn't have your hand right over the flag. And he was stealing American secrets. And he was selling them to the Russians.
Who is this?
Richard Branson. Then you have Aldrich Ames. Same thing. You know, pillar of the community, hyper-conservative Christian, always wore the flag pin, had the flag, would yell at people if they didn't recite the pledge and do that kind of stuff. Selling CIA secrets to the Russians. So there's performative patriotism, and then there's a couple of friends of mine who run around and do BLM protesting. But one of them saved multiple American soldiers over in Iraq. And another one did non-nuclear proliferation for the CIA. And they've put their lives on the line for this country. But because they love this country, they don't have to do the performative stuff. It's like, and I'm going to say this from a woman's perspective, it's like the guy who's really huggy on you in public, and it's because he's cheating on you behind. So he's huggy and he's all performative, and then when you're by yourselves, he's mean, and then it turns out he's cheating.
I think you might have that kind of illustration, but then I think you also have the lack of willingness to be honest about American history and about the ills, the systemic racism, the fact that all of the property that we say is ours is stolen land, the fact that that the wealth of this country was born on the back of slavery. Like, people just don't want to own that.
Well, true love for something is to own it, warts and all.
That's right. And that, to me, see, I think that you talk about performative patriotism. I think what we need is honest patriotism. Like, it's okay to, like, I love the freedom that we have here. I love so much about America in concept, but I can't ignore the warts you're just talking about. I can't ignore, you know, like the fact that black men are still being killed, shot 7 times in the back by a police officer, you know, in the back.
The strength of America has always been our willingness to face our shortcomings and to try to fix them. It's been our ability to adapt. And you have these rigid people who want, you can't fix what you don't face. So that's important here.
Well, and through this conversation, we've said multiple times that protest is deeply ingrained in our Americanness. And so being a patriot means protesting, means speaking your mind and standing up for things that are wrong, standing up for things that you see as inequalities or inequities in this world, and doing something about it. That's patriotic. That is what this country is founded on, and that's why we have that written in our First Amendment rights.
If you love a child, you're going to correct him or her. If this child is trying to run out in the street or they're trying to grab an oven, you're going to pull them away. If you love your country, you're going to pull your country away from something bad. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are some people who think leadership is don't nobody bring me no bad news. The best leaders will be okay when you go in their offices and say, you are screwing up, and this is going to get you in trouble and the rest of us in trouble, and we need to stop it. Let's just say I had to do that to somebody at my job last February. And to give him credit, he listened. He could have thrown me out and made my life hell. But he fixed it. And he listened. And I won't say the name.
That's good.
To protect the...
We don't want to get you in any more trouble than you usually are in.
I live in trouble. It's just what I do, you know? But a smart leader will listen to, this isn't working. A smart leader will not kill the messenger when somebody tells them this isn't working. The problem is we have too many people who think that any sort of criticism is hatred.
Yep.
You know, and you've got to hear criticism in order to fix stuff.
Or is unpatriotic.
Yeah.
People think that criticism of American history is unpatriotic, and we've got people saying in 4th of July addresses that teachers are teaching kids to hate America. And that's simply not true.
If I say that my dog is not the brightest of dogs, that doesn't mean that I hate the dog. It means I need to take the dog to obedience class.
So what you're saying in summary is we need to take America to obedience class.
I didn't say that.
I'm going to call up Eric Lindquist and say this is a quote directly from Selika tonight. America needs to go to obedience class.
He would post that. You know he would put that, and he put it above the fold, too. Yes, Eric, you would. Don't even try to deny it.
All right. So we've only got a couple minutes left. As always, thank you, Selika. Thank you, Adam. I want to talk a little bit about action steps. And honestly, these may not be as concrete as you like them to be, as we like them to be sometimes, but really, we got to educate ourselves. A protest that happens in Eau Claire is not the same thing as what might happen in Minneapolis or Milwaukee or Kenosha or whatever. Things like Antifa. We don't know all there is to know about what that organization is doing in these protests, but there's a lot of us who think we know a lot of things. And toward that end, please listen to diverse news sources.
Snopes.
Yes, use Snopes.com. Snopes.com is a great resource.
Fight the propaganda.
Yes.
I mean, if somebody is, okay, I'm going to pick on QAnon. Because QAnon is just...
You weren't going to talk about them tonight.
I wasn't, but it's just too... You gave me a softball. You know, QAnon is just a repeat of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. It's a 1902 Russian forgery that took an anti-Semitic set of blood libels and put them in a pamphlet. And the whole QAnon conspiracy is they took the pamphlet from the Elders of Zion and then they just said, here, this is the secret knowledge. And I'm like, it's a forgery from 1902. Are you nuts? Google is your friend.
Always be a little
Snopes
leery of the
friend.
Secret knowledge. Always be a little leery of the secret knowledge.
If it's crazy stuff like eating babies, it's probably propaganda. If it's busloads or plane loads of BLM, it's propaganda. Come on, let's react to reality. Think through it logically. Instead of just reacting to it and wanting to grab your gun. You can't do that in this world.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really, and let's be honest, why would a busload of black people come to Eau Claire? Think about that logically. Why would they want to come here and burn stuff? Don't you think we got better things to do? And no offense, Perkins is great, but the Main Street Cafe in Osseo is better. So if they're coming here for the pie, they're going there. Let's get real here. Think about propaganda. And what this generation needs to understand is that just because somebody tells you something and it sounds like something you want it to be, that doesn't mean you fall for it.
All right, look, I love you.
Go.
But you got to stop. 'Cause it's almost 9.
Oh, all right. We always go over. Go.
All right. I just want to share some closing thoughts. So we've talked about Colin Kaepernick back in 2016, beginning the kneeling protest during the national anthem before NFL football games. And there was an outcry, obviously, we've talked about people who thought it was inappropriate, disrespectful on some level, all those many things. And we really haven't evolved much from that spot. Just last Thursday, during the Kansas City Chiefs and Houston Texans game, there was a show of unity before the game where the players were interlocking arms. And the crowd booed because they were standing and showing unity during the national anthem. And it makes me think that perhaps the problem might not be protest in and of itself, that maybe the problem runs a little bit deeper. There was a recent article in the Washington Post, an editorial by Trey Johnson, a Black American writer. This is from August 28th, 2020, and I would like to close out my thoughts with his thoughts because they're so much better than what I could bring to the table. These are the words of a Black American writer. So what if this country was founded in protest over British rule? So what if it was brutalized and pillaged in the service of those protests? So what if those upstart protesters brought with them scores of involuntarily enslaved Africans, many of whom themselves protested at sea? So what if many of our ancestors who found themselves on American soil continued protesting on plantations? So what if protest has always pushed and pulled at us, unmade us, and let us make ourselves again? When people ask you about the point and purpose of protest, it is not because the notion of it is at all new to the American political discourse, quite the opposite. It is because they've redefined protest to fit their disdain for Black Americans. I want to thank Pablo Center for housing us and providing all this incredible support from a production standpoint. Thanks once again to Uniting Bridges. Thanks to Converge Radio. Thanks to Selika for being such a great partner in crime, and Adam, AJ, and the gang here from Pablo. We appreciate you greatly. I have this really cool shirt on that says #715-4BLM. If you would like this shirt, you can buy one down at Tangled Up in Hue or go to their website, and the proceeds from that will benefit Uniting Bridges. Aside from doing something really cool for Uniting Bridges, you'd look really good with this shirt on. I know that. Next week, I'm very excited. We're going to be talking about Black masculinity, heart, and soul, and we're going to be focusing in on the emotional well-being of Black men in America. I've got my good friend and brother, Willie McCaleb, who will be joining us, Thurgood Dennis, former great athlete at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, who will be here as well, and we may have a couple other folks as well. So thank you so much for joining Conversations in Color this week, and we hope to engage with you next week as well.